How do you hijack a cargo ship loaded with weapons and leave no trace that it ever happened? On a moonless night in October 1993, a freighter cleared the port of Piraeus with manifests, bills of lading, and a veneer of legitimacy and sailed into waters crowded with commercial traffic and naval patrols. Officially, the vessel was bound for an arms broker in North Africa, but somewhere between departure and scheduled arrival, the ship ceased to be the cargo it claimed to be. This dramatized reconstruction uses composite characters and fictionalized timelines inspired by Tradecraft and declassified operations to ask a simple question: how do states solve impossible logistics when their survival is at stake? Over the next minutes, we will reconstruct the planning, the false vapor trail, the night at sea when people traded places and identities, and the public investigation that found gaps too neat to be accidental. The story moves from a ministry office in Tel Aviv with coffee-stained maps to a cramped safe room on the third deck smelling of diesel and canvas, and ends in a courtroom of public opinion where documents refuse to align. Imagine standing on the bridge at 3 in the morning, the salt spray tasting like metal on your lips, watching radar blips cross your screen in a forest of white. First, we need to understand why a government would risk the chain of custody of lethal cargo and who decided that secrecy was worth sidestepping sovereignty. In the early 1990s, regional politics were brittle. Borders were porous, embargoes were porous, and proliferation networks had grown sophisticated. For a small state surrounded by adversaries, the calculus of deterrence was simple and ruthless. Officially, the policymakers spoke of strategic parity and resilience. Behind closed doors, the conversation was about supply lines, plausible deniability, and the time it would take an adversary to field a new weapons batch. Prime Minister character Amnon Bar-El in our reconstruction argued that delays in procurement could cost lives and that legal routes had been closed by embargoes and by the tightening of the international financial system. He convened a national security committee that included Director Eitan Rosen of the National Intelligence Agency, an operations chief known to colleagues only as Commander Levi, and a civilian logistics expert, Avi Cohen. The fear driving them was not ideology alone, but a calculation based on technical timelines. Certain systems, once denied, could be procured through circuitous channels if one controlled the delivery. The decision to act was framed as defensive. The rhetoric of necessity packed protocol into a moral argument. When senior officials convened in a secure room, the air smelled of cigarette smoke and cold metal from the coffee urn. On the table lay maps, manifests, and photographs. The choice to cede a chain of custody with false certainty began with a question of timing. If the normal routes were blocked, could a state bypass visibility without leaving a forensic pattern? For Amnon and his circle, the answer was yes, if they built the right camouflage. Officially, the procurement program was a civilian defense contract. Dealing publicly with third-party vendors and end users, the ministry published innocuous statements about modernization and routine purchases of inert components. De facto, the program leaned on layered front companies and permissive ports. A Cyprus-based shipping company with a plausible corporate history was resurrected overnight. Alina Markov, presented as a logistics consultant, was a corporate figure whose name appeared on incorporation papers, bank accounts, and fake insurance certificates. The front company had a telephone number that connected to a nondescript office and to a receptionist who had been briefed to sound uninterested and efficient. Documents recorded a legitimate-looking end user in Tripoli and payments traced through shell accounts in Geneva and Dubai. Diplomatically, the maneuver had to preserve the fiction while insulating actual state actors. That meant strict compartmentalization. Only a handful of people knew the true route and final recipient. In Tradecraft terms, the operation relied on creating an ironclad chain of custody on paper while ensuring the physical chain could be diverted. Publicly, the ministry spokesperson issued routine denials about any irregular purchases. Analysts in foreign capitals noted the paperwork but had no access to manifest discrepancies. Internally, the cost of plausible deniability was high. There was political risk if the operation was uncovered and diplomatic fallout if an ally felt deceived. Yet the operational argument prevailed. The program moved forward with contracts, insurance, and port bookings that would pass cursory inspection. Logistics became the problem. The cargo in question was a palletized shipment of small guided munitions, detonators, and specialized fusing components that required careful handling and secure storage. Technically, the materials were not radioactive or biological, but they were controlled items with a high potential for misuse. The real vulnerability was the chain between manifest and hold. Once a container enters a ship's belly, it moves through a chain of custody that includes stevedores, manifest clerks, port inspectors, and the ship crew. Any weak node could be exploited. Alternate options had been considered: direct air transport, covert trucking, or assembling parts domestically. Air freight was too visible and traceable. Overland convoys risked checkpoints and satellites. Domestic assembly would need materials not easily procured. The conclusion was that the sea remained the least traceable option if one could manipulate the paperwork and the crew. The materials were packaged in government-sealed crates that on paper matched a different bill of goods. Temperatures, humidity, and stacking constraints were detailed in technical notes. A single mistake in storage would compromise the cargo. The planners read every line of shipping regulation and found the loopholes where documentation outranked physical inspection. The operation began where most covert schemes begin: paperwork and people. A small office in Nave Sha'an became the hub. Captain Vasil Petrov was contracted as the shipmaster, an experienced seafarer with a record of accepting unusual charters and a need for steady income. The front company employed a manifest clerk named Jorge Hernandez, who would file papers and sign forms on the dock. Engineer Hassan Al-Masri was told the cargo contained inert mechanical parts for a large industrial project. Dock foreman Marco Rossi was paid to rearrange yard schedules and to produce a stamped receipt. Analyst Dr. Miriam Katz provided briefings on expected inspection patterns at ports. The recruitment of the crew was surgical. Only 9 of the 42 seamen were told the truth and given instructions to behave as if every crate belonged to the declared client. Others were given cover stories and per diems. The operation built a false chain of custody that began in a warehouse outside Athens, where crates were sealed with official-looking seals and camera footage showed forklifts moving generic boxes. We reconstruct a scene in which Elena, Jorge, and Captain Vasil sat under a buzzing fluorescent lamp verifying paperwork. The air smelled of oil and cardboard. Elena spoke in a low voice. "I need every number to match." Vasil replied, "The crew will follow what the manifest says." Jorge added, "The port clerk is asleep at 3 in the morning, so we have a window." Hassan breathed in the diesel and said, "The hold will be secure." That brief exchange masked layers of instruction in coded notes and contingency plans. Documents were faxed, then shredded. Bank transfers were routed through several jurisdictions. Publicly, the shipment looked impeccable. Night fell over the Aegean as the ship slipped its lines. Weather reports predicted calm seas, but sea conditions can change and cover opportunity or peril. The central set piece of this story is the transfer at sea. The plan called for a rendezvous with an unmarked freighter in international waters, where cargo would be transshipped under the cover of darkness. The operation hinged on timing, radio silence, and the cooperation of a sympathetic second captain. Sensory details sharpened the moment. The spray tasted of salt and iron. The deckboards vibrated underfoot with an endless drone. The only light was a weak lamp and the cold bit behind the collar. On the appointed night, a small rubber boat approached and men in dark clothing climbed aboard carrying sealed crates. Commander Levi, posing as a technical inspector, moved through the hold with a clipboard, his boots scuffing the metal, the smell of grease and sweat thick in his nostrils. Dialogue between Levi and Vasil was terse, with 5 exchanges that build tension. Levi said, "We are on schedule." Vasil replied, "Your papers are in order." Levi answered, "Check the 4th crate." Vasil hesitated and said, "It feels heavier." Levi smiled. "I would not worry about weight." Vasil asked, "Who authorized this?" Levi looked at him and said, "Higher than you think." Vasil swallowed and said, "What if someone inspects?" Levi placed a hand on the manifest and said, "Then we will be very convincing." Each line hit a protocol and a contingency. Nearby, Elena whispered coordinates into a short-range transmitter and heard only static in response. A low metallic clang echoed when one crate was moved, and for a breathless moment every man on deck listened for horns or the distant throb of an approaching patrol vessel. The transfer took under 3 hours. The men worked with practiced economy. Rope creaked, footsteps were muffled, and the sea held its breath. By dawn, the ship resumed course, its cargo altered and its record immaculate. Not every scene was as technical. There were human moments that betrayed doubt and fear. Backstory explains the protagonist whose hands shaped the operation. Commander Levi grew up in a port city where ship whistles were as common as church bells. As a boy, he learned the language of tides from a grandfather who mended nets and from his mother who kept ledgers. He studied engineering before being recruited into intelligence. His early career involved intercepting smuggling networks, interviewing captains who lied with the easy cadence of seasoned sailors. Those interviews taught him that papers are language, and language can be forged. In the late 80s, he lost a close colleague in a raid that went wrong. The loss left him wary of obvious solutions and convinced that subtlety could prevent bloodshed. These experiences hardened his conviction that if a weapons delivery could be diverted without a firefight, then lives might be saved. His backstory is not a justification but a lens. In office basements, he learned to fold strategy into innocuous business plans. He wrote memos that read like procurement proposals and ran simulation exercises in empty warehouses. The memory of the raid lingered as the smell of cordite lingers in an old uniform. When senior officials debated options, his soft voice often carried the weight of a man who had seen plans fail and people die. The operation had secondary players who added color and potential failure points. Dr. Miriam Katz, a logistics academic, produced risk assessments and testified to the legality of certain transit clauses. Elena Markov managed cover companies and coordinated bank transfers. Avi Cohen negotiated insurance and port slots. Captain Vassal oversaw the crew and maintained radio discipline. Jorge Hernandez handled manifest paperwork. Marco Rossi arranged dock access and a chain of stamped receipts. Hassan al-Masri ensured the hold was seaworthy. Admiral Ben Yair provided strategic cover with a diversionary naval exercise in public documents. Each named person performed an action that moved the plot forward, and each had motives ranging from patriotism to financial necessity. Their presence created a web of plausible deniability and human complexity. The public phase began when the freighter arrived at its declared destination. On paper, everything matched. On the quay, officials logged signatures and customs officers noted the clearest of paperwork. Yet an inspector later raised an eyebrow at a weight discrepancy. A journalist in Tripoli filed a short piece about an unremarkable arrival. Then a rumor circulated that a smaller vessel had been seen near the rendezvous coordinates and that crates were lighter than expected. The ministry issued a statement that shipments were routine. International monitors requested manifest verification and found documents impeccably clean. Investigative reporters began to dig and found small inconsistencies. An audit trail showed payments routed through companies with no employees. Satellite imagery showed 2 vessels in proximity on the night in question. Interviews with stevedores revealed nervous silences and polite refusals to speak on record. The public inquiry produced contradictions, testimonies that did not match timestamps, and security camera footage with missing frames. Official denials used the language of plausible ambiguity. The narrative of a lawful shipment took shape in public while an alternate story gathered in classified channels. Moment of tension 1 came when a young dock worker contacted a private investigator with a grainy photograph of men moving crates in the dark. For 550 characters, that moment forced the operation to account for a leak. The photograph could unravel the cover or be dismissed as fake. The handlers convened emergency meetings. They weighed exposing the worker to risk or burying the lead. They chose containment. Payment quietly altered his employment and he moved to another port. The photograph was stored in a vault. Moment of Tension 2 was the mid-sea transfer and lasted as a sustained 520-character description of manual labor under threat. Men moved crates over slick decks, the rubber boat rocked, a coil of rope snapped, sending water into the hold, someone cursed in Russian, and silence followed as a distant horn echoed and passed like a phantom. The operation held its breath, improvising with knots and whispered commands until the sound faded and the crates were secure. Moment of Tension 3 occurred when the ship returned and a customs weigh revealed a 5-ton discrepancy. For 580 characters, authorities debated an inspection that would open the hold and reveal the cargo. The decision to delay inspection by citing technical issues at the dock was political. A call from a minister intercepted the clerk and the clock ticked. By the time the hold was opened, plausible explanations had been planted and the discrepancy was recorded as clerical error. The opportunity for forensic proof evaporated. Investigations continued. Years later, partial declassifications and leaked cables offered crumbs. Analysts pieced together shipping routes, bank transfers, and calls between front company officers. A leaked memo referenced a sanctioned rendezvous in international waters. Experts in international law debated whether acts taken in secret in international waters violated sovereign rights. Diplomacy took the path of murmured protests and closed-door discussions. Publicly accused parties denied knowledge. Courts found insufficient admissible evidence to prosecute because papers were crafted to withstand cross-examination, and witnesses recanted or could not be located. The official verdict remained ambiguous. The law could not easily litigate what intelligence agencies do in the shadows. Consequences rippled outward. Regionally, the shipment shifted power calculations because a cache of munitions vanished from an anticipated supply chain. Neighboring states read the signals and adjusted deployment cycles and procurement priorities.
Internally, the operation produced doctrinal shifts in the intelligence agency. Protocols for front companies were formalized, and the use of commercial cover normalized in internal manuals. Internationally, arms control regimes tightened tracking protocols, and ports adopted more stringent verification. The operation, successful in the narrow objective, raised ethical questions persistent to this day. Did the secrecy that averted an immediate threat erode norms of transparency? Did end justifying means create a precedent for other actors? The debate split academics, former officers, and policymakers. We are now at a pause. If you were surprised to learn how layered such an operation can be, you are not alone. Many viewers do not imagine that choreography of paper and people can substitute for battles, and yet, for some decision-makers, it is the only viable path. What do you think? Should a state resort to this kind of action to guarantee its survival? Reply in the comments starting with "I think that" and tell us the city you are watching from. Your answers help us understand how different communities weigh security and ethics and guide our next investigations. We will read and highlight comments that open new angles or bring sources to light. Now return with me to the night of the rendezvous, where technical improvisation met human fear, and everything hinged on a list of numbers. In the epilogue, we examine consequences in 3 beats. First, the immediate aftermath. The operation met its narrow objective, and the targeted weapons did not reach their intended recipients. Classified cables circulated in secure channels, noting the success and the minimal diplomatic fallout. A few operatives received commendations in closed files. The public record remained vague. This immediate result altered military postures in the region and bought time for procurement of alternatives. Second, the institutional fallout. Internal reviews led to codifying methods that had been improvised. Manuals incorporated new processes for setting up front companies, for cleaning financial trails, and for managing deniability. Training programs adapted to teach false paperwork techniques alongside traditional intelligence craft. This normalization raised the risk that such approaches would be used more readily in future operations. Third, the moral and legal echo. Years later, scholars and retired officials argued that while lives were spared in the short term, the erosion of legal norms had long-term costs. Trust between states frayed, and the international system adapted with more intrusive inspection regimes and tighter port controls. The debate persisted in op-eds, academic journals, and closed seminars. The question lingered as an ethical riddle. Do the ends justify the means when the means involve deliberate deception of international partners and manipulation of commerce? In the end, the ship sailed with a changed hold and no public confession. Documents declassified decades later offered fragments but never a full accounting. The strongest evidence remained discrepancies in manifests, payments traced through shadow accounts, satellite tracks that aligned with the alleged rendezvous, and testimony from a handful of operatives who spoke only under guarantee of secrecy.
Anonymity. The operation, fictionalized here for narrative clarity, captures a broader truth about how states sometimes act when visible options close. It asks whether secrecy can be a form of stewardship or whether it simply consolidates power into hands that answer to no public. Were lives saved by the clandestine diversion, or was a precedent set that weakened international norms? Tell us in the comments and subscribe if you want further deep dives into operations that shaped geopolitics. If you want more documents and reconstructed timelines, we publish new episodes regularly. Because often, the most consequential choices are the ones that never make the headlines.